Hello, Seahawks, and thank you for joining us for the first official Student Live of the new semester. So for those of you who are just joining us, you might be new to the format. If you have any questions or comments during today's broadcast, you can feel free to enter them right down below. I'd also encourage you to take a quick minute to share this stream with somebody in your social network who you feel could benefit from today's segment. So all throughout the month of February, we will be celebrating Black History Month and the prominent figures who dedicated and really still continue to dedicate their lives to civil rights. Last month, we actually hosted our annual MLK Day celebration, talking about the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his constant pursuit of the civil rights dream. So we are very excited to continue that conversation with you all today. But in order to do that, I have a very special returning guest with us, Professor Stephen Balkaran. Welcome back, Professor. Can we go ahead and jump right in and talk a little bit about Dr. Martin Luther King's life?
Well, first of all, Vince, thank you for Broad College for giving me the chance to be and speak on the legacy of Dr. King. I hope this will be an historic event as we kind of talk about Dr. King and his philosophy. One of the things that always caught my eye is one of his quotes. He says, "I choose love over hate. Hate is too much of a burden to carry." And given the current racial climate in the United States and Black Lives Matter and all police brutality we've been talking about, I think it's important to really understand the legacy of Dr. King, understand the dream, understand one day we should just all live together. I went back and I looked at Dr. King. I researched the speech for you, Broward College, home of the Seahawks, because Dr. King spoke here in the 1960s in South Florida, in Fort Lauderdale. Obviously, the beaches were segregated. He was in St. Augustine, Florida. So he has a great connection with South Florida. And when I looked at his speech back in the 1960s, one of the things he was talking about in 1960 was the need for civil rights, the need for America to acknowledge its constitutional obligation of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So when I give speeches throughout the country and I talk about civil rights, people often question, well, why are we talking about civil rights? Civil rights and human rights is an American story. It's embedded in two of the most important documents in our country, one, the Declaration of Independence, and two, the United States Constitution. So Dr. King, always challenged America to live up to the true values of this country. And what are the true values? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, due process of law. So I went back and I kind of researched some of the speeches he gave here in Miami, in Fort Lauderdale, in St. Augustine. And again, he talked about the need for civil rights. Some 60 years later at Broward College, home of the Seahawks, we are having a conversation about the same story, about the same speech Dr. King gave 60 years ago. And what is that, ladies and gentlemen? It's the need for civil rights. It's the need for America to acknowledge the constitutional rights of African Americans and the basic philosophy that we all live in this great country that is obviously life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, where all are respected and acknowledged. So the dream in 2021 is obviously an important dream. I think the topic of this talk today is civil rights, the legacy of Dr. King, and where are we with the dream? So before I even start with Dr. King, I wanted to obviously talk about even a greater icon in civil rights. And I gave the speech some years ago and people looked at me kind of funny when I thought there was somebody actually much bigger than Dr. Martin Luther King. I know I see the faces here at Broward College, the home of the Seahawks, they're all looking at me in a very strange way. There was someone much bigger than Dr. Martin Luther King. Her name was Coretta Scott King, the wife of Dr. Martin Luther King, often in the background of civil rights, never in the forefront. But it was Coretta Scott King who played a very important role behind Dr. King and behind the civil rights movement. Her daughter tweeted a couple of days ago, Bernice King, in the honor of my father, please honor my mom as well. She was the architect of the King's legacy, end of quote. She was the architect of the King's legacy. And if you study Coretta Scott King, we always talk about Dr. King, and rightly so. We always talk about Rosa Parks, and rightly so. We forgot about Coretta Scott King. She was fighting civil rights long before she met Dr. King. Before they were dating, before they became married, she was fighting civil rights. She was the third generation of African Americans from Alabama to go to college. And back in the early 1950s in Ohio, Antioch College, she was fighting for integration in the student body in college. So before she met Dr. King, she was obviously talking about civil rights. Let's not forget that African American women and white women and women, period, played a very important role in this talk today, civil rights. Civil rights wasn't a Dr. King male-dominated legacy. It was all, even here in South Florida, a huge Hispanic community. If you look at Cecilia Cruz from Cuba, she played a very important role in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So there was a number of factors when it comes to civil rights, and we have to talk about women, white women, African American women, and Coretta Scott King, Dr. King wife. Let's not forget, obviously, their ideas, their civil rights ideas was the backbone of Dr. King and the civil rights movement of the 1960s. When he was killed in 1968, April 4th, and I'll talk more about that as I lecture, she was a single mom. It was Coretta Scott King who pushed for congressional approval for MLK Day. Coretta Scott King. MLK Day is celebrated, ladies and gentlemen, in 100 countries throughout the world. Let's think about it for a second. Over 100 countries acknowledge the philosophy and the legacy of peace and justice of Dr. Martin Luther King, and that was done by his wife, Coretta Scott King. Nobody talks about that. Nobody fulfills African American women and white women and their role in the civil rights movement. In 1979, it was Coretta Scott King who pushed for the King Center in Atlanta, that we should have a center that obviously acknowledge the work and the legacy of Dr. King, a museum that we could all go and visit and have a reflection. One of the topic of my talk is reflecting on Black History Month. Dr. King, the legacy and the legacy of civil rights. She led in the 1980s the apartheid struggle in South Africa. She pushed for congressional blockade of economic sanctions on South Africa. So when we talk about, civil rights, let's not forget Coretta Scott King. Let's not forget the white women who played a very important role. His mom, Alberta King, played a very important role in the civil rights movement. Dr. King's mom, she's often negated from history. Mahalia Jackson. When we watch that famous speech, I Have a Dream, it was Mahalia Jackson in the background saying to Dr. King, tell him about the dream. Tell him about the dream. African American woman, Ella Baker, and so forth. So there was a number of people who played a very important role, but women were often negated because of the sexism in the civil rights movement. So I wanted to acknowledge the role of women, Coretta Scott King, Dr. King's mom, and all the beautiful women who played a very important role for the struggle for equality in the United States. So as a result, here we are talking about Dr. King, the legacy and Black History Month. So some 34 years ago, ladies and gentlemen, Ronald Reagan signed into law an act that obviously called it MLK Day in the United States, a federal holiday class, and obviously a day we reflect on the legacy of Dr. King. But as the day goes on year to year and so forth, we are both reflecting and remembering the legacy of Dr. King. As we celebrate his birthday and Black History Month and the great contributions of African Americans into the American history, clearly woven, I always pose that philosophical question, what happened to this famous dream? We all watch that film every Black History Month, and what happened? Ladies and gentlemen, Seahawks, Broward College, Dr. Martin Luther King, a survey was done in 1967, was the most hated man in America. Let me repeat that. He was the most hated man in America. Phones on being tapped by FBI, okayed by Bobby Kennedy. He was the most hated man in America. Now, some 60 years later, we all embrace this philosophy. What happened? What did he die for? We celebrate Dr. King's legacy and the dream of civil rights. What happened to all the promises? I address all those promises in my book, Broken Promises and Broken Dreams. Well, let me talk with Dr. King for a second. He's kind of interesting because I've interviewed so many of his close colleagues who have since passed, and may their soul rest in peace. But Dr. Martin Luther King was a very simple man. Many folks don't realize that he was never about accolades. He was never about, Dr. King Day and this award and that award and so forth. He was a simple man who loved to play with his kids. Every Sunday, he would take his kids to the YMCA in Atlanta because that was the only day African Americans could use the swimming pool because they were segregated. And you'll see great photos of Dr. King swimming with his kids in Atlanta, Georgia. He liked to hustle pool. Many folks don't realize that he loved to shoot pool. And if you knew Dr. King back in the 60s, always before a pool table, trying to, outplay someone. He loved to eat chicken wings, fried chicken. That's what he did. Eat chicken wings and play pool. Very simple man and all the accolades, but it's important that we understand he was a human being besides his great icon leader. He was a father. A brief history of Dr. King. He lived in my great state, the state of Connecticut. He lived in my town. He worked at 14 and 15 in Connecticut picking tobacco. So when you hear the great mountaintop speech, that mountaintop speech was inspired by his life as 2 years in the great state of Connecticut, where he picked tobacco, where he went to all the various stores in Connecticut and nobody gave him a hard time. He writes letters back to the King Center, articulating where he sat in restaurants in the front seat and nobody gave him a hard time, especially coming from a segregated South in Atlanta. He loved the great state of Connecticut. At 27 years old, he had an earned PhD, doctorate from Boston University. Could have been anything in society. Could have been a professor at Broward College. Could have been a governor, a US congressman, a senator, a university president, but he chose to represent the poor. Let's think about it for a second. Many of us chase this high-profile jobs, especially myself when I was in law school, and none of us ever became social justice and civil rights professors, which eventually became my calling. Dr. King was clearly someone who I looked up to, and I didn't want to chase the big corporate jobs. I rather teach civil rights and social justice, as you said earlier. He was a human being. He was a father, a husband, a friend, a pastor. He didn't die in a drug overdose. He died fighting for garbage workers in Memphis, Tennessee. Let me repeat that. He died fighting for garbage workers in Memphis, Tennessee, the lowest of the strata, garbage workers. He died, ladies and gentlemen, with $300 in his bank account. Many folks don't know that. It was never about money. It was never about all these great things that we have today. It was an awful price to pay for freedom. When he was assassinated, class, ladies and gentlemen, on April 4th, 1968, the city of Memphis gave the garbage strike workers a 10-cent raise. Let's put it in perspective for a second. We talk about civil rights and the legacy of Dr. King. He died and the garbage workers got a 10-cent raise. That's an awful price to pay for freedom. Died with $300 in his bank account. What's even more interesting about Dr. King, and I cannot share the story, is that his legacy wasn't an American legacy. His legacy was an international legacy, transcended beyond national geographic areas, religious group, political system, boundaries, waters, oceans. He was an international legacy. And I said earlier, many folks don't realize this, MLK Day is celebrated, ladies and gentlemen, in over 100 countries throughout the world, countries where he never been. But his inspiration, his legacy, what he stood for, peace and justice, resonated with world population. In 1964, he won the Nobel Prize, at that point, the youngest ever in world history. And while in Stockholm, Sweden, he stopped in Germany, a very interesting story. He stopped in Germany because he wanted to visit East Berlin. We had West Berlin and East Berlin. Those who study the Cold War will probably know what I'm talking about. Those who don't know the Cold War, I think you guys are called the millennials, the new age of kids. So there was two Germanys, one East and one West. And Dr. King went on the border and gave a speech to the East Germans. And he talked about love, he talked about brotherhood and Christian unity. He later writes, obviously, there was a young officer, KGB officer, who had heard Dr. King speak. And some 35 years later, after I heard that great speech, that officer wrote, and that letter is in the Cold War Museum in Berlin. That officer writes, it wasn't Margaret Thatcher, it wasn't Ronald Reagan and maybe tear the wall down. It was the words and inspiration of Dr. Martin Luther King he heard some 35 years ago. That young man, 35 years later, is a guy we call Mikhail Gorbachev. Let's think about it in perspective, that many of us don't know Dr. King, his legacy. Eating chicken wings, shooting pool, but also, ladies and gentlemen, influencing international policies. The Cold War Museum and Mikhail Gorbachev thanking Dr. King, not Ronald Reagan, not Margaret Thatcher, but Dr. King, a Black man from Alabama, who studied in Alabama, who lived in Alabama, who lived in Atlanta. So even today in 2021, we see movements, social movements, Black Lives Matter, movements in the Middle East, and they're all having that philosophy of Dr. King. I am a man, peace, justice, and the philosophy of nonviolence. So what happened? So every year, I'm asked to give a speech, not by Broward College, but universities throughout the country. And as we observe Black History Month, we observe the birthday, what happened to that dream? What happened to that dream of civil rights and Dr. King? So far, I spent the next 15 minutes talking about the dream. So I start off with a quote from one of my books, and I simply says, ladies and gentlemen, and I quote, integration of the races have left a blind eye to many of the social disparities that Dr. King and the civil rights movement vowed to dismantle. End of quote. Now, I'll be the first to acknowledge that we have made progress. People kind of jump at me when I give the speeches that we have not made progress. We have made progress in this country. I'll be the first to acknowledge that, especially in 2008 when we elected our first African-American president, when 55% of white voters voted for African-American. It showed two things in the United States. One, that we were willing to put our ugly past behind us. And two, we were willing to move forward when it comes to race relations and embracing the African-American community and culture in the United States. But what happened? 2021. Well, this dream, this debate has never materialized. If you look at Black Lives Matter, the Charlottesville protest, the white supremacy protest a couple of weeks ago, all these things play into obviously a divided country as we continue to look at this dream. Race and racism, ladies and gentlemen, in Broward College, home of the Seahawks, continue to be a significant factor as we delve into the waters of race in America. At the dawn of the post-Obama administration, several questions remain haunting in our society. That is one, race and politics is alive and well in the United States, and we are not living in that post-racial society or that dream that we keep talking about, that dream. We still have a long, long way to go. And I believe the problem, ladies and gentlemen, is the failure to talk about race, the failure to acknowledge that we have a problem here in the United States and that racism continues to exist. It fuels one of the most debatable topics in the United States, race in America 2021, the legacy of Dr. King and the civil rights movement. After all, that's the topic of this talk today. I pose this question to all my audience, students who want to tweet me and get on the chat. Why haven't we gone beyond the issue of race? We are still in 2021. We're still having this dialogue and discussion we had in 1960s. And what's interesting from my book and my research, we have had more protests in the last 4 years. We've had more protests in this country for social justice, civil rights, and change that we had with Dr. King and his movement in the 1960s. Let me repeat that. We've had more protests in the United States in the last 4 years, during the last 4 years, for social justice, civil rights, and change in the United States than Dr. King and the civil rights movement. It's a documented fact throughout the country. So something didn't happen if we are still complaining and have more protests. So what is the root of this problem? Has to be a problem. How do we solve it? What do we do? I think the history of the United States has been closely pegged with racism and discrimination against African Americans and women. It's an issue the founding fathers have struggled to address in the early stage of this great nation. And as a result, it has continued to haunt the legacy of this country. During segregation, the civil rights movement, modern day and legalizing systematic racism, police brutality, criminal justice system, all these factors are now playing into the racism that obviously is perpetuated in the dream that we have not achieved. So in the 21st century, Broward College and home of the Seahawks, there are still many facets of oppression that exist and are prevalent in society. Since the inception of this great country since 1776 and even beyond that, we have a house of democracy, a country that supposedly perfected democracy. It's plagued with cracks of racism and discrimination against African American and women. And during the last 300 years, we have made little attempt to fix these cracks in our defective foundation. And as a result, there lies the problem. We have a house with defective foundation. We have a house with cracks that has permeated racism and ignorance and stereotypes and biases against people of color. And there is the problem, and that's why race matters. Many of us refuse to come to terms that the African American struggle is a struggle against racism and oppression in a country that has still refused to acknowledge or apologize for its wrongdoing. Let me repeat that. We still live in a country that has refused to acknowledge or even apologize for its wrongdoing. And as a result, many Americans refuse to admit that racism is a societal problem. There was a survey done some years ago, and when asked about racism in the United States, there was a completely different story since 2009, once Obama became president, would race still be an issue? And 80% of African Americans said yes, race is still gonna be a problem. And when asked whites, white Americans, 80% of white Americans said, no, what do you mean? We have a black president. There's no such thing as race anymore. On another survey, 25% of white Americans believe Elvis is still alive and he lives in the Bahamas. So what does that tell you? If 25% of white Americans believe Elvis is alive and refuse to believe that we have a race problem, it tells you obviously we're not living in the same world. Only conversations about truth, the need for reconciliation, and America's acknowledgement of its wrongdoing can lead to a more racially tolerant society, where the American dream can be enjoyed by all despite their race or color. That was a keynote speech Dr. King gave in 1963, August 28 in DC. That we all can live in a racially tolerant society where the American dream can be obviously enjoyed. And as we look on January 2009, when the first African-American president was sworn into office, the idea, ladies and gentlemen, Broward College, that America was willing to put behind its ugly past and move forward to a more post-racial society, becoming a more tolerant nation, where Dr. King's dream will be fulfilled and enlighten all of us. Our increased expectation America would transcend beyond race, and both white and black racial attitudes would undergo a fundamental change has never materialized. The president of the first African-American and his first family has not in any way, shape, and form alleviated racial stereotypes, biases, nor have they engaged in any constructive dialogue post-Obama and race in America. A recent poll taken in 2013, this is kind of interesting when we talk about statistics and numbers. I mentioned one earlier. Question was asked in 2013 by the Pew Research, by Gallup poll, I'm sorry. And the question was, do you think that race relations between black and whites will be a problem in the United States? And 40% of Americans said race relations between black and white will always be a problem. 40%, let's hold that number for a second. 40%. It's important in the lecture, it's important to talk, because the topic is legacy of Dr. King and chasing the dream. That same survey, ladies and gentlemen, Broward College, was done by Gallup poll again in 1964, at the height of racial tension in the United States, the height of the civil rights movement. The same question was posed. And 42% of Americans believe that race would always be a problem. 42. 2013 was 40. So we made an increase of this 2%. Okay, this illustrates, ladies and gentlemen, class of numbers don't lie, very little, if any, progress has occurred in the last 50 years when it comes to race relations as we enter the 21st century, as we have a constructive dialogue about race in America and how we look at this dream and the legacy of Dr. King. In 1964, one of the most important legislation was passed when it comes to civil rights equality and the respect for all in this country. Transgender, LGBT communities, African Americans, Hispanic immigrant group, racial, religious biases. And that's called the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Arguably one of the greatest and most important legislation we have in this country. This supposed class ensure barriers be torn down, theoretically anyhow. It should eliminate what we call discrimination against African Americans, women, and people of color, including Hispanic, Asian Americans, people of transgender, people with disabilities, and so forth. As a result, this law was to hold our government accountable. Some 60 years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that philosophical question has been posed: has our government defaulted on that promise? Have they defaulted? African Americans, and rightly so, have often complained about not being treated equal still in society, in the workforce, in colleges, in university, and in society in general. The idea of living in a post-racial society where all races are guaranteed the benefits of the great American dream and our due process and racism no longer exists seem to be lost and has disappeared in many, many communities. Look at the disparities that's taking place, obviously, in the United States between whites and blacks. So this comes to the core of my lecture. For the next 15, 20 minutes, I want to talk about this part of my lecture. Understanding the legacy of Dr. King, who he is, understanding the civil rights movement, what happened, and posing that philosophical question: where are we with the dream? What if Dr. King miraculously arrived today at Broward College in this lecture? How would he feel? Would he be happy? Would he be outraged that he had lost his life of his family and his young kids without a father, looking at some of the things that still occur in the United States? Gone are the days when famous Alabama Governor George C. Wallace, who famously preached segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Whites only and colors only signs that looked over water fountains, baseball parks, swimming pools, bathrooms, restaurants, you name it. Gone are those days of those, what do you call, overt racism. As we enter the 21st century to 2021, silent and not overt racism exists in our school system, in employment and poverty, healthcare, prison, immigrant communities, and other sectors of society. It's also permeated in ways in which we don't even realize, and takes the best of who we are as Americans and what we can become, as Dr. King said, a more racially tolerant society. So as we acknowledge the civil rights act, as we acknowledge the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, we have to be very cautious how we talk about civil rights. We have to be very cautious because it's still a dream in progress. So some of the elements I want to talk about, some of the public policies I believe that clearly has articulated that we went backwards when it comes to the dream. The first and foremost, ladies and gentlemen, is education. Dr. King was an educator. He believed, obviously, that it was the great highway towards racial equality. And a very famous case came before the US Supreme Court, as my law students will tell you, in 1954, Brown v. Board, which established class that state laws that created white schools and inferior black schools for African American and obviously students of color was unconstitutional and can no longer be part of the United States. The Brown decision, ladies and gentlemen, was supposed to end segregation within the American education system and ultimately lead to the destruction of racial discrimination in other areas of American life. Very important case. And I advise all the students who are in part of this lecture today to look at the Brown v. Board, collection of 5 cases that began to dismantle what you call racism and white supremacy and black inferiority in the education system. The idea Dr. King believed in education was that simply it should be for all colors to become one and to enjoy the benefits of this great nation. That idea has been lost, obviously, embedded in what you call a race-based education system. Despite eradicating legalized and systematic racism with the Brown v. Board case, Harvard University Civil Rights Project reported schools are more segregated today than they were in the 1950s. The report shows that obviously schools are becoming more and more segregated for African Americans. Some 80% of African American kids attend high school where they are the majority. So integration obviously has never fulfilled. Some 50 years after the March on Washington, almost 80% of African Americans attend segregated schools. According to a civil rights project in UCLA, despite the positive effects in education and other areas resulting in the court's Brown decision, the decision by no way, shape, and form or by any means has been successful in dismantling institutionalized racism in education. End of quote. Civil Rights Project in the United States looking at education. Schools are becoming more and more segregated today. Common Core, No Child Left Behind, all these Race to the Top programs has left many Black and brown kids far behind. If you look at some of the statistics here in Fort Lauderdale, it's quite evident between obviously white districts and obviously predominantly Black and brown districts. So I wanted to share something with you guys. I want to be very cautious how I say this because people jump at me. I am all for integration of the races. I've always been a civil rights activist, but the implementation of the Brown v. Board decision remains one of the most disappointing policies in civil rights history and continues to perpetuate today, obviously looking at test scores, how Black students perform in test scores and how white students. Okay, there's obviously a huge disparity between inner suburb kids and inner city kids. In fact, I have concluded in my book and in my research, the quality of education you get in the United States depends on the zip code you live in. Chasing that dream, topic of this talk today. Dr. King, the legacy of civil rights and chasing that dream. The quality of education you get today depends on the zip code you live in. Number 2, poverty. The war on poverty in the United States was supposed to eliminate, poverty in this country. Yet it's one of the most, evident things in our face. Some 50 years after President Lyndon Baines Johnson talked about the war on poverty, making poverty an American issue, the top of his priorities. not only poverty in Black and white communities, but also white Appalachian communities. Dr. King, fought for poor whites. He wanted to ensure there was government programs in place, Head Start, food stamps, to help reduce poverty in the United States. But some 50 years after Dr. King's and President LBJ policies, Dr. King had a Poor People's Campaign where he wanted to shut Washington, D.C. down. We see poverty continues to be a great divide in this country. One of the most promising hopes of Dr. King was the equal opportunity for Blacks to share in the nation's economic prosperity. His transition from civil rights to human rights reminded us, ladies and gentlemen, his commitment towards equality, despite all ethnic and racial background, we should all achieve the American dream. Poverty rates for African Americans, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, in 2017 was almost 30%. And it continues to grow with the COVID-19. We've all seen those, free lunch and so forth in parking garage and camps out here. It continues to grow. And every demographic African-American family are 4 or 5 times behind white families when it comes to wealth and equity and obviously prosperity. Single moms in the African-American community. Black kids, some 35% of Black kids are raised in poverty, almost 1 in 4, equivalent to third world countries, right here in the United States. So that's kind of interesting to see, obviously, some of the poverty and so forth. If you look at the last major one I want to talk about, and we talked about this earlier, I think, obviously, criminal justice system. I think has to be one of the most best kept secrets, obviously, in the United States. Police, and we saw that with Black Lives Matter. I'm always asked that philosophical question, what do I believe in Black Lives Matter? I believe it's an interest group that has a profound effect in the United States. But the criminal justice system has to be addressed. One of the best kept secret class in the United States is the race-based criminal justice system. People of color continue disproportionately to be profiled, incarcerated, and sentenced to death for the same crimes that white commit. Not only people of color are locked away, obviously, their civil rights are taken away. The right to vote, fundamental element, obviously, in our society, access to college financial aid, job opportunities. And this continues to plague, obviously, predominantly Black and brown community. There's a very interesting sentencing project out in California. There's a lot of research on our prison system. And there's an interesting quote I share with this lecture today. As long as racism exists within our society at large, it will find that within the criminal justice system, racism glass fuels the biases that we have. As a result, criminal justice laws and the profit behind it has become the top issue. Let me repeat that key word. The profit behind criminal justice has become a key issue. End of quote. So if you look at people of color, crack cocaine law, the disparities in the sentencing process, obviously 1 in 5 African-American male is obviously incarcerated in his lifetime. And as a result, that has a decimating effect on Black communities and Black families. The nation's first African-American president, as I kind of conclude the last 5 minutes of this lecture, led to increased expectations that America will put its racial ugly past behind, that we will get better education system, better criminal justice system, fix our poverty, our healthcare. Look at COVID-19. That also exposed the way people of color get their healthcare system and how they are dying at a faster rate in 2021. One of the good things that came out of COVID was it established the disparities in healthcare between poor inner city Black and brown communities and inner rich suburban communities. The fact that we become a more racially tolerant society, the promise that America will transcend race and ethnicity, and both Black and white racial attitudes will undergo a fundamental change. Yet we are still chasing that dream. Having an African-American president would enlighten Dr. King. The fact that we're able to move on and obviously solve some of the great issues in this country. Some years ago, I gave a speech in Stony Plattsburgh, quite similar to this on civil rights. Stony Plattsburgh is in upstate New York on the Canadian border. And at the end of that speech, there was an older woman who came and said something to me. I'll share that story with you guys before I conclude. But when Dr. King was assassinated in 1968, April 4th, it led to a government investigation called a Kerner report, K-E-R-N-E-R report, 1969. And what it established, ladies and gentlemen, in 1969, after the death of Dr. Martin Luther King, that we were living in two America, one Black, one white. In 2021, we still have the same issues that we were fighting back in 1960s, and we've actually went backwards in so many capacities. That's why I started with the quote, integration of the races has left a blind eye to many of the social disparities that the civil rights movement had vowed to dismantle. So let me come back to SUNY Plattsburgh. I met a very sincere, beautiful older woman who came and thanked me for talking about civil rights. She said, Professor Balkaran, I want to thank you for what you do, because not too many of us talk about civil rights, especially we only hear it for Black History Month, and then the rest of the year we forget it. And I had a civil rights project back at the university back in Connecticut, and she wanted to thank me. She said to me, young man, my father was a garbage strike worker with Dr. King. My father was part of that movement. I am now a federal judge in New York State. Think about it for a second. And the reason why I share that story, to all the students at Broward College, home of the Seahawks, we all have a story. I advise you to find your story, live your story, come back to Broward College and tell your story about civil rights.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Balkaran, for sharing all of that information with us about his life, his legacy, the successes that we've had in terms of civil rights, and obviously, as you pointed out very eloquently, some of the shortcomings, right? Saying that it's still a dream in progress. But we really appreciate you sharing about how that legacy continued to live on and how it did because of people like his mother, his wife, his daughter. So really appreciate you taking time to share that with us today so that we can continue to push forward that dream and one day see it as a reality.
Thank you, Broward College, for having me for this last 45 minutes. I'm honored to be part of your Black History Month, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Well, thank you, Seahawks, also for tuning in. Be sure to check out the survey link that we have listed in the description below so that you can actually send your feedback to us about today's live segment. And we hope to see you again next week as we kick off a brand new series of our student lives entitled Live Your Values. We'll see you soon.